We're going to be studying from John chapter 6 this morning. Titled this lesson, "This is Indeed the Prophet," a response the people gave to some things that Jesus did, and we'll take a little journey getting to that point. But just to kind of think in the big picture for a moment, Jesus had his ministry. He's going from town to town, preaching the message of the kingdom. And there's a phase in his ministry where he goes from nobody knows who he is to an incredible level of popularity that was difficult to control even. That had a tendency of getting out of hand in ways that Jesus did not want. This was spurred mostly by the miracles that he worked. There was spectacle to them. There was excitement to them. He was accomplishing amazing things. Everywhere he went, he was healing the sick and raising the dead and doing things that nobody else could do. And so we see such fascinating responses from people, like the religious leaders beginning to get angry at Jesus because he is a threat to their popularity and their place in the Jewish system. But he's so hard to ignore that in John 3, one of the Pharisees under cover of night goes to see Jesus. He wants to hear more of what he has to say, even though he's going against the rest of his sect. It was hard to ignore Jesus' power. Jesus spoke to a Samaritan woman at the well, a woman who his people viewed as less than human, as inherently immoral and not worthy of association. And he spoke with her like she was a human being, like she was worthy of respect and worthy of good treatment. But then he also challenges her and exposes the fact that she has sinned and that she needs to live differently, which she does do. And she becomes a very vocal advocate for Jesus in spreading that he is the Son of God and he is a great prophet. In front of a large crowd on another occasion, Jesus heals a boy without even seeing him. Some official comes to Jesus and asks, "Please heal my son. Please come with me to my home." And in this case, Jesus actually denies the crowd the spectacle because the problem that's starting to crop up is he's got people who are following him just to see what he does next, just to see what great work he will accomplish. And Jesus did do a lot of good things with his miracles, but he didn't come to the earth just to work miracles. And so he tells the crowd that unless you see a sign, you're not going to believe, even though they've seen so many signs. And so in this case, he denies them the spectacle, and he tells the official, "Go home, your son is already being healed." And the official goes home, and that is, in fact, the case. Jesus heals a paraplegic at the pool of Bethesda instantly and powerfully on the Sabbath. He asks him, "Do you want to be healed?" The man is focused on this pool and whatever healing power he thinks that it has, but Jesus heals him separately from that. And so we've got a whole list here of things happening early on in Jesus' ministry in the chapters leading up to John chapter 6. But this last one here is a big point of contention. The religious leaders have already not been happy with Jesus, but this pushes them over the edge. How dare he heal on the Sabbath? The Sabbath is not for work, and healing is work. On the Sabbath day, you're supposed to stay at home and to do nothing. The Sabbath had morphed and taken all sorts of interesting forms, and not even according to the law that they were given. There is an actual command for the Sabbath day, but just the traditions of the elders, of the fathers, the things that had been passed on from generation to generation, where the Sabbath day grew to encompass a lot more than God ever said that it was supposed to. So Jesus is not breaking the Sabbath in the way that the law actually dictates, but he is breaking the commandment of the religious leaders at the time, which Jesus was not afraid to do, but doesn't exactly endear him to them. But the defense that he gives in John 5:16 through 18 is, if it is okay for God to work on the Sabbath, it is okay for Jesus as the Son of God, to work on the Sabbath. And that is an interesting argument, to be sure, because it's an argument that's not just a defense, but actually a bolder claim. He is escalating his claims. He is showing that he is more than just somebody who understands the law better than they do, but that he is actually the Son of God. Predictably, this stirs up the anger of the religious leaders, and it says they sought all the more to kill him. Jesus attests that his claim of being the Son of God is supported by many witnesses, supported by the Father, by the testimony of John the Baptist, by the signs that Jesus worked, by the scriptures themselves, and by the prophecy of Moses. And the religious leaders are furious, but the people are enthralled. Jesus leaves to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He needs to go on to his next destination. I imagine in part because the religious leaders right there are ready to seize him and kill him, and it is not yet time for that to happen. So let's get away from those people and go on to another place, continue teaching as Jesus had been doing. And this is when we get to John chapter 6, about how Jesus feeds the crowd. Jesus is sitting down with his disciples on a mountain, and he's teaching them. This is a picture of how a rabbi teaches his disciples, that phrase of sitting down with them. But as they're doing that, they look up, and they see in the distance a great crowd of people who have been following them, and they're still coming. They have not been dissuaded. They are ready to see whatever Jesus is going to do next, and they are trying to find him. And Jesus turns to Philip, and he says, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" It seems like a perfectly logical question, but it's really not. This is a bizarre question. This is a question like if I ask Lauren today, "Lauren, where's the best place to buy a yacht in San Diego?" She says, "Do we care? Are we in the market for a yacht? Are we ever going to be in the market for a yacht?" I don't know where one goes to buy a yacht. I don't need to know, because I couldn't possibly buy one, and I don't expect that I ever will be able to in my entire life. So the question of where do we go to buy one is completely irrelevant. Now, how does that connect to this? Well, Jesus is asking Philip, where do we go to buy to buy bread for all these people? And Philip's response is, the problem isn't where to buy the food. He's saying 8 months worth of wages wouldn't buy bread to feed all these people. And we're not sitting on that kind of money. Before we ask where to go, let's ask where we're getting the money to even purchase that amount of food. Now, Andrew is looking for a solution to this problem. Andrew finds a young man who's got a little extra food, but not nearly enough. It says he's got 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Barley loaves are poverty food. The poor people ate barley in that land then. And when we hear barley loaves, like we're imagining big loaves of bread that might last you a week today. These aren't those. These are little loaves of bread, kind of like a pita or some small personal-sized amount of bread. Luke 11 and verse 5, which is a completely different story, but it implies that 3 might be a reasonable amount of food for a single person to eat for a meal. So that's kind of the amount of food we're talking about. So this young man, he's got 5, and he's got 2 small fish. So what that amounts to is he packed an extra sandwich for the day. That's how much extra food we're talking about. He wasn't totally sure how long he'd be gone, and so he threw an extra sandwich in the bag so that he wouldn't get too hungry. That's great for him, not great for the thousands of people on the horizon who need to be fed. Well, the people arrive, the people are hungry and need food, and Jesus has compassion on them. He says, let me take that extra food that this young man has. And Jesus prays over it and distributes it to the whole crowd. And miraculously, somehow, it fed thousands of people. They even gathered up 12 baskets full of extra food once everyone had had their fill. Now, mind you, they didn't start with 12 baskets of food, so they have actually ended with more than they started with after everyone is completely sated. This is a miraculous event, a miraculous power of Jesus to be able to feed the crowd with an amount of food that is woefully insufficient. Well, there's a point to this miracle, and this is showing echoes of other things throughout the Bible. In 2 Kings chapter 4, you can turn over here if you like, 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 38 through 44, we read about Elisha and his band of prophets who are going into a land of Gilgal, and they run into some problems. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 38 through 44. And Elisha came again to Gilgal when there was a famine in the land. And as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, set on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. One of them went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds, and came and cut them up into the pot of stew, not knowing what they were. And they poured out some for the men to eat. But while they were eating of the stew, they cried out, O man of God, there is death in the pot. And they could not eat it. He said, then bring flour. And he threw it into the pot and said, pour some out for the men, that they may eat. And there was no harm in the pot. A man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, give it to the men that they may eat. But his servant said, how can I set this before 100 men? So he repeated, give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. So he set it before them. And they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. So we get some connections here with Elisha's miracle. Elisha and his band of prophets are in Gilgal, and there's a famine in this land. A famine means that there is not enough food for the residents of the land, much less people who are passing through or who don't typically live there. And so he and his men are reduced to foraging, trying to find anything that you can eat, just growing. And a lot of people are hungry, so there's not a lot just sitting around. And everyone's going this way and that. Anything you can find, let's throw it in the pot and make a big stew out of it. And we can feed the whole crowd of people with this stew. And somebody doesn't identify a gourd correctly and puts a poisonous gourd into the pot. A whole bunch of them, actually. There's a reason why those hadn't been eaten yet. They were not all they were cracked up to be, and they began eating it and realized there is death in the pot. This is dangerous. We can't eat this. And Elisha is able to neutralize the harm of this poisonous stew. He says, throw some flour into it, and now it is safe to eat. He's able to resolve the problem there miraculously. That's not really the one that connects to the story of Jesus feeding the thousands, but it does give you a picture of how desperate they were and what happens in the next miracle. Somebody comes to give a generous gift to Elisha. He has respect for Elisha as a prophet and for his men as prophets, and he comes with a gift for them. It's 20 barley loaves and some fresh ears of grain. That might not be particularly generous in normal times, but this is not a normal time. There's a famine. So giving up any amount of food for somebody else is very generous. And so Elisha accepts this gratefully, and he tells his servant, distribute this to the men. And his servant goes, how would I do that? There's not enough food here. It's pointless and maybe even insulting to try to divide that small amount of food for 100 men. You know, imagine inviting the whole congregation here today over for lunch, and you've got a package of hot dogs. Well, divide it up among the whole crowd. Like, it's silly to the point of absurdity that you wouldn't try to do that, and you might even insult people by assuming that you can. Elisha's servant saying, how do I even begin to do this? This is not enough food for 100 people. There's no way to divide it. Elisha repeats the exact same thing. Divide it among the men, pass it out. But he adds, the Lord has said that they shall eat and have some left. And so Elisha's servant passes it out, and somehow they all eat, and they have some left. It's a miraculous event that is a smaller version of what Jesus did. Jesus was able to do a similar kind of miracle, and I don't think the similarities are coincidental. This is supposed to ring in the ears of the people who are hearing Jesus and witnessing what he is doing, to know that he is operating in a miraculous way, in a way like the great prophets of old were. But Jesus has done it in an elevated way. We see similarities in that there was a crowd of desperate people. We see little food, but not enough. We see provision from God to end up with more than they started with. But in Jesus' case, every part of it is better. It's not just 100 men, it's thousands of people. It's not 20 barley loaves, it's 5. And the leftovers, there's not just some left, there's 12 baskets of leftovers. So everything that Elisha did, Jesus did better. And that implicitly shows that he is greater than Elisha. The people's reaction in John 6:14, they say, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. They didn't miss what Jesus was showing them. They didn't just say, hey, we've got some food, don't ask questions about where it came from, this is great. They knew what they were looking at. This is the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, when they say the prophet, and a lot of translations have that word prophet capitalized, and to show that was a messianic prophecy, that prophecy is referring to what Moses said when he prophesied, but there was coming a day when there would be a new prophet like him, but who would be better. And this power and fulfillment was not lost on the people. Jesus did more than Elisha, and he also did more than Moses. Jesus has shown one of the key miracles that God worked for the people of Israel. Remember that the crowd of Israelites were lost in the wilderness. They were wandering at God's direction, and they had no food to be able to supply all of these people. And they despaired. They said, we'll die out here in the wilderness because we left the beautiful, abundant land of Egypt where everything was good and we were never mistreated. Everything was perfect there. We should have gone back while we had a chance. But instead, we'll die out here in the wilderness. And God tells them, now, your memory of Egypt is pretty rosy there, for one. I saved you. I delivered you from the agony and the misery you were in, the brutal oppression that you were facing. But also, do you think that I brought you out here into the wilderness to die? Why would I do that? Why would I rescue you from the danger of Egypt just to have you die in the wilderness? I told you I'm taking you to a beautiful land, to an abundant land. You're not there yet, but I haven't forgotten what you need along the way. So God provided them with manna every day. And then later when they complained about not having enough variety of food, which is, pretty rich when you're in the wilderness and we're on the brink of death, God gave them quail too. So God, through Moses, was able to supply food for the people. And that was one of the most standout miracles that God ever worked for the Israelites. Jesus has just shown he can do the same. He fed the thousands of people with a woefully insufficient supply of food. And so not only is he making the implicit claim, I am more than Elisha, he's making the implicit claim, I am more than Moses. And so when the people say, this is indeed the prophet, they're dead on. This is indeed the prophet. And Jesus is making that bold claim for them to see and to know. The connection is striking and unavoidable. But the crowd does not truly understand Jesus. They are obsessed with him. They have fallen in love with him and with what he can do, but they do not understand his true purpose. They are ready to seize him and to make him king by force. Tell us what you're here for. Tell us where to march to. Mark's account of this tells us that Herod Antipas noticed what was going on, and he was worried about what Jesus had in mind. Because I remember the Pharisees and Sadducees and all of those religious leaders, they hated Jesus because he was a threat to their popularity and religious power. Herod doesn't care about that. He is nervous because Jesus might foment a revolt here, an insurrection. Jesus is getting very popular very fast. Now I want you to think about what this looks like. Jesus goes out away from town, and a large crowd of fired up people follow him, and they want to make him king, and they're ready to go anywhere and do anything for him. What does that look like? That looks like Jesus is building up his army and getting ready to revolt. And so Herod Antipas was very, very worried about this. And he feared what Jesus was going to do. So several things needed to happen here. Jesus needs to defuse this situation. The popularity is good if they will hear his message, but these people aren't really interested in the spiritual message that Jesus has for them. Instead, they are looking for a political revolution. They have revolt on their minds. If some time can pass, a few things can be accomplished. The people might calm down, and they might be ready to hear what Jesus actually has to offer to them. But additionally, when they get out of this area, it will prevent Herod Antipas from flipping his lid. We see what happens later is that Jesus and his disciples go over to Capernaum, and that was a different region, but Herod Antipas isn't in control of anymore. So that's going to put his fears to rest, that if Jesus is assembling this army and ready to march against Herod Antipas, well, now he's going the wrong direction for that to happen. Jesus has disconnected from the crowd, he's slipped by them, and he's also going away from the potential threat of attacking Herod. So Jesus needs to defuse all of this in order to accomplish what he actually wants to accomplish and to not have this turn into a political revolution that he didn't actually come here to do. And so Jesus backs away. But I don't know if you can read that down here or not. I've titled this point, Backing Away Without Backing Off. And what I mean by that is Jesus withdraws to the mountain. He backs away from the people to avoid continuing to stir these people up. And his disciples get on a boat and they go to Capernaum. So they're splitting up and letting all of this calm down. But although Jesus is backing away from the crowd, he is not backing off from the claims that he was making. That's a really important point. Because unlike some of the other events we see in the Bible where there's a fired up crowd ready to call some man God or the great power of God, think about when Paul and Barnabas or Paul and Silas, I forget which now, Paul and Barnabas it was, that the people said, this is Zeus and Hermes, and you guys are gods. And Paul and Barnabas say, whoa, hold on. That's not who we are. Don't bow before us. That's not proper. Or when Cornelius bows before Peter, and Peter says, don't do that. That's not proper. Jesus is backing away from the crowd, but he's not backing off from the claim that he is indeed the prophet. And we're going to show that based off what he does next. The disciples get on a boat. They're going to Capernaum. They're out on the Sea of Galilee. It is nighttime, and the sea has gotten rough. There are strong winds blowing them around. They're several miles from shore. This is a precarious situation. And Jesus did not go with them, remember? He went up onto the mountain, and it kind of confused the people. They weren't totally sure where to go to follow Jesus, or they should be following the disciples. But the disciples are kind of in trouble out here on the water. And Jesus comes to meet them. Well, they have got quite a head start on Jesus, and they're on a boat, and he's not. But, this is Jesus we're talking about, so none of those are really obstacles. If Jesus wants to meet them out in the Sea of Galilee, then he'll meet them out in the Sea of Galilee. It doesn't matter that he doesn't have a boat. It doesn't matter that there's a storm. He walks out on the water to meet them. And the disciples predictably are terrified, because when you're on a boat and you see a figure walking out on the water toward you, you kind of think something's gone wrong, or maybe you've lost your mind. But Jesus says, do not fear, it is I. And the disciples very gratefully and gladly welcome Jesus up into the boat, and they get to their destination, and the story can continue. But this shows us something important. This is not arbitrary that Jesus has walked on the water. The people said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. And we said, but that was dead on. That was absolutely correct. Jesus is not ashamed of the claim. By working this miracle, he has doubled down on the claim. Because he has now done 2 miracles that connect him to Moses. He fed the crowd of people as the Israelites were fed in the wilderness, and he had a miraculous crossing of water like Moses did in leading the people across the Red Sea. Jesus is not backing off from his claim. He is indeed the prophet. He has indeed come to save the world, and he is not ashamed to let people know it. Jesus' claims will continue to be pressed throughout his ministry, but the faulty assumptions of the people needed to be checked. Jesus is not going to liberate Israel from Rome, nor will he sit on a physical throne in Jerusalem. He continues to shock everyone that he meets. Anyone who even gives Jesus a small amount of consideration has to have some strong opinion about him. For some, it was the claims of divinity that was enough to anger them. But there were others, like the people in this crowd, who accepted the claim of divinity or the claim of being the Messiah, but it was the purpose that bothered them. It was the exact goal of Jesus as the Messiah that was shocking to them. And so Jesus had 2 crucial things that he needed to accomplish at this stage of his ministry. Establishing that claim that he is in fact the Son of God, but then managing the incorrect expectations of those who did believe the claim, but didn't follow with what his purpose was. Those things remain true today, actually. Because part of what we are doing is we're trying to convince others that Jesus is the Son of God. And that's something that we need to have faith in. But it's also important for us to have faith in what he will do with that. You know that Jesus is not subject to your expectations. and your ideas of what you think he ought to do, it is not enough for you to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. You also have to have faith that what Jesus does is right, and that it is your job to submit to him, not his job to submit to you. Jesus is King. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the one who will judge the world, and what he does is right. It is our job to follow him. We're about to sing Victory in Jesus, number 359. That's where our victory comes from. And if you are willing to submit yourself to him, to put him first above all, above every preconceived idea you have, an expectation you have of God and what you think God ought to be doing, throw all that away. Believe that Jesus is King. Believe that he gives you victory, and submit to what he commands you to do. We can help you today. We can baptize you for the remission of your sins if that is your desire. Whatever your need is, come forward as we stand and sing.